Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Caitlin Buckley. I'm a marketing specialist here at 451 Research. Today's webinar, the 2019 Trends in Information Security, will be presented by Scott Crawford. Before we dive into the content, I just want to give a brief introduction to 451 for those of you who aren't familiar with us. 451 Research is a top-tier research and advisory firm headquartered in New York City. Our team of more than 100 analysts cover more than 2,000 technology vendors and service providers each year. 451 provides unique insight into emerging disruptive technologies and the companies taking them to market. And we deliver that insight via syndicated research, advisory services, and live events around the world. Before I turn it over to today's presenter, just a few housekeeping items. The webinar slides can be downloaded in the resources section of the On24 platform. And there's also a link there where you may download a complimentary excerpt of the 2019 Trends Preview Report. You can submit questions to the presenters in the same platform for the Q&A at the end of this webinar. And the webinar recording will also be available shortly after today's session. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Scott.
Thanks, Caitlin, and welcome, everyone. Glad to have you with us. This is a webinar that we do every year about this time, so you can look ahead at the coming year. Just a little bit about myself. Caitlin's told you about 451, but about me, I've been an industry analyst for some time, but before that, I was a practitioner myself. I was a Chief Information Security Officer for a non-governmental organization, which in my case refers to an organization affiliated with the United Nations. I was the CISO for the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization at the UN's third headquarters in Vienna, Austria. And prior to that, I was a Systems and Security Specialist and Manager at the National Center for Atmospheric Research here in Boulder, Colorado, and I'm based in Denver, so very fortunate to be located where I am, thanks to this career. I've also worked on the vendor side of things. I was a security strategist for IBM Security Services prior to joining 451, and so that's given me a view across at least three different aspects of the industry, which has been very useful in my work here as an industry analyst. We're going to talk about the topics that we covered in our 2019 Trends in Information Security report that we published towards the end of 2018. That report, we had a lot of contributors to that report, including the analysts on the information security team here at 451. Dan Kennedy is our analyst, primarily serving our Voice of the Enterprise survey-based research organization. And a lot of the survey data that you're going to see in today's webinar is prepared and delivered for us by Dan and by the Voice of the Enterprise team here at 451. Garrett Becker, our senior analyst covering data security and also identity and access management and trends there. Fernando Montenegro, who's been covering cloud workload security for us. Has a report coming out actually on that topic fairly soon, so be watching out for that. Also covering endpoint security for us for the last year and a half. Eric Ogren covering security analytics, security operations, and technology such as security information and event management and security automation. Aaron Sherrill on the team covers managed security services and security services more generally. We have some very interesting data points on that topic, which I think you'll be interested to see no matter who you are coming up in this deck. And Patrick Daly, who's our primary analyst covering security for the Internet of Things. So what stands out for us in 2019? Across the team, what are the things that we've been looking at that do stand out for us, that we're keeping a closer eye on in 2019? And before as answering that question, I have to couch that in terms of some of the larger overall trends we've been seeing here at 451. And in the last year, we published on this. We published a firm-wide report entitled Foresight, which looks at some of the megatrends, if you will, that are shaping the nature of IT and IT evolution. And with it are shaping security as well. The first of these major overall trends is what we call the trend towards invisible infrastructure, meaning the increased abstraction of IT, a trend that began largely around the rise of virtualization in the 2000s, but it's since gone on to set the pace for the evolution of technologies that we now associate with cloud computing, and also the evolution of IT in increasingly abstracted approaches to infrastructure itself, making infrastructure more directly programmable as software. And the trends that are defining that move in that direction, not just to the cloud, but to the embrace of these newer approaches to IT. The second overall major trend we call contextual experience. another way to think perhaps of digital transformation, if you will, which is really characterizing the increased penetration and pervasiveness of digital technology throughout virtually every aspect of human experience, from the very personal to the level of personal health tracking information, personal health information generally, to the level of the multi-global organization that is increasingly relying on this information, not only to base their business on, but with the increasing penetration of visibility throughout all these environments, all these applications, and the ability to control them. And that's linked very closely with the third major trend, pervasive intelligence, also closely associated with the rise of trends like the Internet of Things, the ability to collect information from billions of new sources, new types of endpoints, new types of ways to interface directly with the traditional experience, both in the enterprise, in the physical realm, and with personal experience. Contextual experience and pervasive intelligence largely going hand in hand, but pervasive intelligence also refers to the rise of technologies such as artificial intelligence, the ability of machines to learn in ways beyond the ability of humans to be able to glean the same insight from the same data at the same level of scope and speed. And the fourth major trend, which really has much to do with our coverage here in the information security practice, around this notion of risk that arises as an aspect of all three of these other major trends. We see a number of ways in which individuals and organizations, as well as technology itself, is exposed to new risks from these new trends, as well as carrying forward the traditional risk exposures we've seen from IT and from the physical realm and exposure of sensitive data that carry forward into these new trends. And really for information security, risk is for us the universal theme. But as far as the major trends that we are looking at in 2019, we see all of these trends being influenced by these other three megatrends, if you will, that are shaping the nature of what IT is becoming. So in particular, in this webcast today, and in our 2019 Trends Report, we're going to look at 5 of these in particular. In terms of the intersections of increasingly invisible infrastructure and pervasive intelligence, we're going to examine the impact, the continued impact of cloud and, if you will, new IT technologies for reshaping the nature of security as well as reshaping the nature of IT in the enterprise. And with a view towards security operations in the enterprise, what things like pervasive intelligence, increasing use of analytics and reliance on analytics and automation mean for security operations, and a trend towards the embrace of what may be considered DevOps approaches, applying those to security operations in the enterprise. Contextual experience and digital transformation are 2 concepts very closely related to the rise of one trend in particular, where we've seen a lot of uptick in the past year and where we expect to see continued penetration in the coming year, and that's around this general concept of zero trust. And we'll elaborate on what we mean by that as we get more into that trend. And then there are some that touch on all 4 of these mega trends affecting IT. In particular, the growing sensitivity to third-party risk coming up in multiple dimensions of security. And in particular, one of the trends that is having a very dramatic impact, particularly on the product vendor space, is the growing adoption of security services to solve a number of problems that enterprises face in embracing their enterprise security strategies. So let's start digging in. We'll start with the first of these major trends, which in our report we characterized as we see cloud providers hitting turbo, if you will, on security, increasing their focus on security. And as they do that, we see customers and vendors that are of necessity needing to rethink their priorities in terms of how they invest in and implement security. And this is nothing short of a revolution for the technology landscape. Those of us who have been in this industry for a while know that we've grown up on securing the high-level priorities of identity and access control, protecting sensitive data and information, visibility into how people interact with technology through visibility into behavior and process through any number of approaches to security monitoring, threat detection, and so on. And in securing those high-level priorities, we also have an emphasis on securing the infrastructure that underlies all of these capabilities within the enterprise. But today, as we see the continued advance of cloud technologies, in particular, we see that customers may no longer be looking so much at buying technologies and stovepipe silos that are dedicated just to security purposes when these capabilities can be integrated with the environments to which they're migrating, with the new approaches to IT to which they're migrating. So, for example, we see security increasingly integrated with cloud platforms themselves, security capabilities offered as offerings by these providers when they can increase the visibility into the provider's environment and serve the needs of security for visibility, monitoring, and control. A lot of these capabilities becoming increasingly subsumed in this trend toward invisible infrastructure through things like the ability to define the configuration of environments like containers, for example, where the security aspects of those definitions, or rather where the definitions of those configurations in those environments do have a bearing on security, we see those becoming integrated with the definition of the environment itself, and therefore we see security being drawn in not only to these environments and their architectures and the tools used to define them, but into the definitions of security for these environments themselves. So we see this confluence between operational interests. On the one hand, IT operations and security are becoming much more closely related in terms of defining the operation environment. At the other end of the spectrum, as these environments are being developed and deployed as applications and as programmable infrastructure itself, we see the people doing the definition, application developers, for example, those who define the architecture of programmable infrastructure, becoming more directly involved in security there as well, too. And the security organization taking as much of an advisory role as they are an active role in defining security for these environments going forward. And that's having a big impact on the practice of security. We're seeing security practitioners that need to become much more versed in and adept in these technologies in order to know how to define security for these environments going forward. We also see the opportunity for cloud providers to leverage their scale and agility and resilience, elasticity, if you will, to be able to deliver a lot greater insight across their environments in new ways that can have a very significant impact on visibility into what's actually affecting those environments and how to respond. So the network effect, if you will, across cloud providers in particular is something that they can leverage in ways that enterprises classically could not. And also the new paradigms of IT deployment. So not just the fact that they're built in cloud native, but these dynamic environments where immutability becomes a factor. If you have an image, be it a virtual machine image or a container image, that you become aware has incorporated vulnerabilities, then you can, in principle at least, with relative agility, define a new environment, define a new image, roll that into production gradually as you retire the old image, and deal with things like vulnerability management remediation with much greater responsiveness, much more effectively than you could with a lot of techniques in the past. So there's a lot of advantages to these approaches going forward. But that's not to say that we're necessarily going to see organizations migrate wholesale to third-party or public cloud providers, for that matter. In fact, in a lot of cases, we see a lot of organizations where IT modernization doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be modernizing these environments off-premises. In fact, nearly half of those we surveyed in our Digital Pulse Workloads and Key Projects study through Voice of the Enterprise in 2018, nearly half of them said that they intended to modernize their existing applications on-premises. That means that they may be embracing these new techniques like containerization. In fact, just among organizations that we see embracing containers, 30% of those surveyed in a most recent study say that they are adopting and using containers now. And that's up from 19% who said that in the past year's surveys. So we see this adoption growing quite a bit. But nearly half of all organizations saying that they intend to modernize their existing apps on premises. Another 18% say that they intend to embrace modernization but deploy in an off-premises cloud environment. Or they may actually repurchase what they've done on premises in the past and do those via SaaS or off-premises providers. And a further 12% saying that they intend to lift and shift their existing applications and move those to off-premises and cloud. So the key takeaway on this slide for us being the 44% that they intend to modernize existing applications on-premise. So this combination of existing approaches combined with more modern approaches and this combination of both on and off premises and both public and private cloud, meaning that hybrid IT will persist for the indefinite future. In fact, we still see organizations that are looking at outright repatriation of their assets. That 13% of them, this is a quarter of all respondents, said that they plan to migrate a public cloud environment either to a hosted private cloud, an on-premises private cloud, or to a non-cloud environment. So part of the driver behind this, by the way, is something worth mentioning here, and that's something that we characterize in our cloud transformation journey studies, that you can find if you're a subscriber and see those on our website. What we've seen is this something of, I don't know that I call it a backlash, but the term that we use for it is the Jevons paradox, which means that the barrier to entry for adopting these subscription services is so low that in a lot of cases, as many of you on this webinar well know, a lot of people just pick up a credit card and subscribe to these services. So it's not hard to, for individual departments and organizations to embrace what has heretofore largely been considered shadow IT in a lot of cases. But what happens, a lot of us experience this on a personal level too. It's so easy to pick up a $7 subscription for, an online storage service. You can pick up the paid subscription to Spotify, for example, and these things add up over time. It's so easy to do. It can be so hard to cancel. And at the end of the month, you wonder where your disposable income went. Well, enterprises deal with the same sort of issue as well, and they take a look at this overall expenditure, and in some cases, they do have this backlash, and they want to get a better handle on controlling their spend overall. So we see organizations looking to become a lot more proactive about their spend on things like the cloud and on things like third-party resources. So, the upshot of all of this is that we expect hybrid IT to continue in the indefinite future. Today, we do see half of all respondents saying that 3/4 or more of their applications and infrastructure, they manage an on-premises environment. But in 2 years, we see these proportions beginning to even out somewhat and a balance. It's not on-prem and legacy isn't, again, not going away. We expect to see a balance of investment across both on-prem and off-prem. So that poses some distinct challenges for the organization. Hybrid definitely here to stay on the one hand, but on the other hand, enterprise security vendors do face headwinds from more cloud native, if you will, types of approaches. And what does that mean for them in terms of product strategies going forward? One of the things to consider is that the advantages of cloud are often confined, I won't say confined, but they're constrained to one cloud provider's platform. You can get scale and visibility from a provider within that provider's environment, but the challenges in extending this across hybrid or multi-cloud environments are still in their formative stages. Regardless, we see that security professionals will need to continue to invest in developing that expertise, and that means that security organizations also need to invest in cultivating that expertise. Difficult challenge of its own, finding qualified expertise, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail later on. But yeah, these are some of the forces that will make themselves felt elsewhere in the market and will come up in some of the other trends that we discuss here later today. The second trend that we're looking at shaping the security marketplace in 2019 has to do with the focus on security operations itself. And we see security operations still undergoing transformation and the embrace of, if you will, DevOps approaches and tactics for dealing with security operations opportunities and challenges. We see organizations looking more towards the DevOps model for how they do things like share information, manage that information, define the ability to recognize new threats, and actually handle security management processes and so on. And in this, we've seen two trends that we forecast for 2018 coming more into full fruition in 2019. In fact, with respect to security automation, we've seen that just in the last couple of days. Yesterday, Palo Alto Networks announcing its intention to acquire Demisto, which is security automation and orchestration, for approximately $560 million. This coming on the heels of Splunk's acquisition of Phantom last year. We expect to see more of those types of deals in that space as 2019 goes along. So we do see vendors embracing automation because we see organizations embracing automation as well too. But we see ways that organizations win and can potentially lose in their embrace of automation at the same time, and things these organizations should be watching out for. They can benefit from more timely actions, better response to situations that lend themselves to automation as they arise, and making better decisions based on the information that can be surfaced through things like analytics that automation can help provide, and automating the response to incidents as they occur. Where they may not benefit so much is if they expect to reduce costs dramatically in the course of embracing automation, or downsizing the security operations team, because persistent difficulty in finding and retaining qualified security expertise remains an issue for organizations, which we'll get into in some more detail when we talk about the embrace of security services. But there will always be opportunity to plug people into security ops. The intent here is to have people focus on what people can do better than automation, and vice versa, to have automation do what the tools of automation can better do than what we typically have people doing today, particularly when it comes to watching log lines scroll by hour after hour in security operations, which is, I know, grossly oversimplifying that. But we want to increase the level of automation so we can increase the sophistication of security operations and lessen the dependence on hard-to-find expertise, and put that hard-to-find expertise on the jobs that they can do better than machines. We expect to see further intersections with DevOps and DevOps techniques as well, too. And this often begs a question that comes up, and we ask it ourselves quite a bit. We see automation particularly defining the nature of the IT environment, and particularly when it comes to infrastructure as code. So the embrace of containers, for example, the use of declarative and programmatic ways to define the IT environment through tools such as Puppet, Chef, Ansible Salt, and so on. Why will that dovetail more with the trend that we see around security operations automation and the embrace of SecOps automation technologies like Phantom, Demisto, and so on? And I think there's a natural tendency to converge between those. To some extent, those fields are today somewhat distinct. SecOps automation platforms are focused primarily on automating security operations tasks for the SOC team itself and for service providers that provide SOC services. And that's a different approach to automation than from defining and programmatically deploying the IT environment. But the two do have intersections, and a lot of times they have tools that can be used, one to benefit the other. And one of the examples of this we've seen in, like, for example, MITRE's advance of its attack framework. And if you've been following that trend, you'll see that a lot of the current information available about attack is actually being hosted via GitHub, including the Attack Navigator, which is a web UI for taking a look at attack signatures, if you will, or attack ways to identify and recognize threat activity in your environment, taking advantage of Stix and Taxi and the attack framework to do so. So that's one example of where tools like GitHub and providing a common repository for these types of capabilities and tools comes into play. We've also seen the introduction of concepts like GitOps, if you will, which means integrating operational functions and tasks that are triggered when certain actions are triggered through interaction with software as code repositories and so on. For example, the ability to perform a code assessment on pull request before you merge software into a given branch or into a given repository of software that may be managed through a centralized or shared repository like Git or GitHub, or of the many others, Maven and NPM just to mention two. We've seen an intersection with these technologies with segments such as software composition analysis, which has the ability to scan environments or be aware of vulnerability, not environments, but the software packages, and be aware of vulnerabilities that are incorporated into those packages before those packages are incorporated with a project that an organization may be building on top of that software, for example. We'll talk about that in a little more detail when we talk about exposure to third-party risk here a bit later on. But these are some of the ways that we've seen some of the DevOps tools and practices that we've seen being embraced in more properly considered DevOps pipelines, and the embrace of these newer approaches to IT, finding their way into security operations. We expect to see more of that in the 2019 and in coming years. So it's hard to mention public and shared repositories without introducing the concept of sensitivity to third-party risk, and this is something that we've been seeing playing out on a number of different fronts. We've seen an increasing reliance on open source, particularly in enterprise software. And depending on whose numbers you see, the majority of enterprise software coming to fruition these days is being built on open source, depending on how you look for it. But we've seen an awful lot of, suffice it to say, we've seen an awful lot of enterprise software development being built on open source packages for a number of reasons, not least of which being just the sheer demand for software. A few years ago, Mark Andreessen became famous for saying that software is eating the world. And a few years after that, he modified that a bit to say that software is programming the world. And it's very true. As we look at the increasing pervasiveness, intelligence, the increasing growth and penetration of IoT, increasing growth and penetration of visibility and analytics derived from that data, we see just a huge demand for software, and the open source community being one very large source of supply. It tackles a lot of the challenges of innovation that organizations would otherwise have to take on themselves. It takes advantage of the visibility of a community, the efforts of a community. There's security benefits of that as well, too, like having the focus of a community on problems as they arise. Things like vulnerabilities can be resolved in principle a lot more quickly and responsibly than a closed source effort. Where organizations run into challenges with that is when you build proprietary software based on open source, and your proprietary software may have issues such as vulnerabilities incorporated into it that you may be depending on the open source community to resolve unless you can resolve them yourself in some meaningful way. We've seen some of the issues with incorporating vulnerabilities into applications through things like the Equifax breach in past years, and we continue to see issues in dealing with that as organizations continue to increase their dependence on open source software. So that's one major aspect of this third-party exposure trend that we've been seeing in the past year. We expect that to continue to play a role in defining security in the enterprise in 2019. We've also started to see increased scrutiny on third-party services, not least in the political arena, as we've seen a lot of issues embroiling here in the United States between the official federal stance on working with suppliers from outside the United States, to say the least. But also we've seen that come up in terms of security incidents, like the British Airways breach from this past year, where a compromise third-party scripts on payment pages led to a breach. But that's not as simple as it sounds. In that case, there may well have been a compromise of administrative level access to those applications that led to the exposure of those third-party services. But regardless, it calls into question the ability of organizations to have the visibility they need into those third-party services, changes that are made to those services that could have an impact on the relying enterprise's risk exposure from those applications. So this is yet another area where we've seen exposure to third parties. So on a number of fronts, we see organizations increasing their sensitivity to this area, and we expect organizations to respond accordingly. And it's not just in terms of the software involved or the technology involved. Late last year, we saw one particularly visible example of the risk posed by people in the software supply chain, with the compromise of the event stream package that led to a compromise of, in Copay's case, a Bitcoin wallet attack. And that was a case where that was a module that had been maintained by a volunteer developer that reached a point where they simply needed help, and someone stepped forward to volunteer to take over the maintenance of that repo. And but it turns out to be a malicious actor and led to a compromise in that repo. And the ironic thing from our point of view about that is that's the antithesis of one of the major trends that we see in 2019, this trend of zero trust. We see in the implementation of IT in the enterprise a big move towards this zero trust and zero trust related initiatives. This is the very antithesis of that, implicit trust in someone who's maintaining an open source package. So we expect to see enterprises respond to that with the continued embrace of open source, and we expect to see providers serving these technologies and these techniques to respond accordingly as well too. How can you vet? Can you vet? Can you assure trust in these environments and these repositories and these sources in such a way to mitigate your risk in relying on them in enterprise development? And of course, Event stream compromise was just one such breach. We saw this in a couple of other cases late last year. So it's not an isolated case. May not be widely prevalent at this point, but it's something where these incidents have increased the sensitivity to and awareness of these types of incidents going forward in 2019. I mentioned software composition analysis. This is one of the technology segments that deals specifically with vulnerability and risk in open source software. And we see organizations increasingly adopting these technologies going forward. So we expect to see this also characterize enterprise development efforts going forward in the coming year. So growing adoption of the technology to deal with open source risk in particular, also feeding into our take on this trend of increased sensitivity to third-party exposure in 2019. By the way, if we have questions coming up during the webinar, I'm going to hold those towards the end. It's going to be a little bit difficult for me to get to the questions as we go through the slides, so be patient with me, and I will get to your questions as we wrap up the webinar going on here a little bit. But I am seeing them and tracking them, so we'll speak to those as we draw the close a little bit later on. So the fourth major trend we looked at in our 2019 preview report revolves around this concept of zero trust. And we have seen one of the largest deals in security revolving very much around that trend, specifically Cisco's buy of Duo Security in the middle of last year for over $2 billion. An interesting buy to us because Duo has arguably been best known in the area of two-factor or multi-factor authentication prior to its embrace of Google's BeyondCorp concept, which is very much predicated on access control to a sensitive environment based on the ability to discern whether or not access to a specific environment is appropriate. And again, that's really very much simplifying the concept. But as distinct from granting access on a very wide-scale basis through something like access to a VPN, having a VPN client that gives you access to a very broad and often very flat network, maybe a private network, but it may be very flat in terms of what it gives access to. More finely grained access based not just on access to a network or even access based on a specific set of credentials, but also determined on whether or not it's the right circumstances, the right context for access from the right network to the right applications on the back end. And where possible, applying analytics to that decision to know that, yes, this is the right circumstances under which access to this resource or this set of resources, and only those resources, should be permitted in those cases. A lot of organizations have heard about zero trust initiatives, even if the implementation is still in its early stages, and that is one of the main reasons why we expect this to be a continuing trend going into 2019. The analogy that we've used, and I have to credit Garrett Becker for this analogy, but we experience this at the airport all the time. We don't tend to pass, the TSA at least anyway, doesn't tend to pass travelers onto a flight based on their source and destination, but we do that a lot in networking at its most simplest level of filtration in a lot of cases. So, checking identity, checking credentials, making sure that it appears that this traveler in this case should be, looks like they're okay to pass through any barriers to entry. This is the analogy that may apply in cases of zero trust, and increasing the granularity of those access decisions in these cases. As that description might suggest, we see zero trust being a meeting ground of multiple technology segments across identity, across network security, as well as across the definition and enforcement of access to applications. A lot of conversions here between existing technology segments such as network access control, software-defined perimeter, which is a bit of a misnomer because in a lot of cases, the perimeter concept is quite dated in light of these techniques. So software-defined networking, software-defined security, if you will, becoming more deeply ingrained into the environment of network virtualization and network access to increasingly abstracted resources. Microsegmentation, another aspect of this same sort of general field in the network, but also technologies that we've seen quite a bit of momentum around, at least on the M&A, in the M&A world, around cloud access security brokers, or CASB, in the prior 2 to 3 years. We even see service providers taking up capabilities in this area, such as with Verizon's acquisition of Vitter's IP. And with it, we expect this to mean even more silo breakdowns, which is welcome news to someone who's a former practitioner in the space. Analysts have their role in defining segments in technology, certainly no secret. But one of the disadvantages of defining technologies by segment is that it tends to stovepipe those technologies and create silos that can be very difficult to break down and integrate, when integration would be better for visibility across the environment, better awareness of context for threats and threat activity, better ability to respond across those silos. That's something that we have always seen enterprises place a great deal of priority on. And initiatives like Zero Trust we see making strides in that direction for the enterprise. Another way in which Zero Trust initiatives can help make strides for enterprises is in something that the devil of all of us in security is that we come from a world where technologies tend to be, they don't always map really well to how people actually work. It's kind of a pain to have to come up with new passwords all the time that include a special character, a number, sacrifice a goat or something like that in order to be able to change your password satisfactorily. And these are just not the ways that people actually work. But we continue to use them because, in the case of passwords, they're cheap, they're easy, we've used them for a long time. Just not the way people naturally work. And so becoming more integral to how people actually interact with technology, one of the objectives, better refinement of access control and better refinement of these techniques and their better integration in trends like Zero Trust initiatives, I think is one of the positive outcomes of this trend that we expect to see going forward. So, you can expect to see a lot more, probably a lot more in terms of M&A activity in this area. By our count, approximately 20 or so vendors in the space that are addressing one aspect of the concept or another, and very well likely broader than that as we broaden out the number of segments likely to be implicated in Zero Trust initiatives going forward. Finally, the fifth and last trend that we addressed in our 2019 report is the continued rise of adoption in security services. The fact that we are seeing security services actually pulling share from the hardware and software markets in InfoSec. And we see that in our research. When we took a look at information security budgets and outlook through our Voice of the Enterprise surveys in 2018, we saw some interesting accelerations. We saw, if you want to characterize increases and decreases by overall budget category, if we look at the spending allocated to third-party supplied software and hardware security tools, we saw those percentages decline year over year, particularly in the past year. Some increased in third-party software between 2 and 3 years ago, but a definite decline there between last year and the previous year. And ongoing declines in terms of third-party supplied hardware security tools, but significant increases last year over the prior year in terms of the expenditure on people, which remains higher than the prior 2 to 3 years in terms of investment in personnel, but a continued upward trend in the adoption of services. So that tells us something about the shifts in the security market itself. At the same time, we see something very closely related in this ongoing demand for skills. It's not that there's any shortage of people that are interested in the field of information security. I mean, Hollywood itself has done a pretty good job of selling that, which may be more glamorous than the day-to-day, as anyone who's experienced Tier 1 security operations can avidly attest. But what organizations desperately need is the skills and experience. And increasingly, they are needing to rely to new sources for that skills and experience other than finding it on the open market, including cultivating it themselves. And, of course, looking to service providers to fill those skill gaps as well. It persists year over year. We've seen this in the last 2 years. In our past couple of years of surveys, we see 80% of organizations reporting moderate to significant difficulty in retaining their existing security staff. And we see this increasingly affecting larger enterprises, which may be a bit of a paradox, considering that larger enterprises may have access to a wider talent pool and employ larger numbers of security personnel. That's not always the case. Small security teams can run security for very large organizations. So finding adequate skills and experience for these more demanding environments may be a factor in finding and retaining personnel for these larger enterprises. For all these reasons, we're seeing and we expect to see continued growth, particularly in managed security service providers. Coping with a complex environment where in the security marketplace, depending on who you ask, we may be seeing more than 2,000 product vendors, depending on some counts, maybe closer to 3,000 product vendors now in multiple segments that are constantly emerging and changing. As we saw in the earlier slides, we see this continued emphasis on hybrid IT that simply is not going to go away and will continue to be a part of enterprise IT for the foreseeable future. We also see organizations that are placing an emphasis on service providers that, historically they may have emphasized on offering services to manage the best-in-class technologies and tools, looking now towards more integrated approaches to their service offerings and the tools that they use in providing these services to enterprises. And we've seen particular segments begin to arise. In coping with this complex vendor environment, we've seen some marquee cases such as Managed Endpoint Threat Detection and Response, or MDR, which grew out of the rise of endpoint threat detection and response itself, EDR technologies, which provide a great deal of visibility into individual endpoints in terms of what's changed, what's been compromised. Can we trace back to, if you will, patient zero? Can we identify where a compromise might have begun on an endpoint in the enterprise? These are tools that give security operations teams headlights into those types of changes. But as such, they're often used by security ops teams. They may be used to escalate an incident when initial indicators suggest that there may be a compromise or penetration underway. And at the time they first arose, they were new technologies a lot of organizations, frankly, didn't have a whole lot of experience with. So managed threat detection and response arose to respond to that gap in expertise that organizations didn't have to help provide the expertise and the capability to serve those new and emerging technologies. So the emergence of new security technologies and dealing with this fragmented landscape is one of the motivators to adoption of security services that we see, and we expect to see that continue in the coming year. Our expectation of compound annual growth in the space is approaching 17% in coming years. So stay tuned to us. We'll keep a very close eye on this space, as it's one of the spaces that we see characterizing the security landscape as a whole this year and going forward. So what do we see beyond 2019? What are some of the topics that we didn't consider, we didn't talk about in as much detail in our 2019 report? I suppose I'll start with buzzword bingo, which is always an avid avocation in the security space. We've seen some terms like, I'm going to drop that word here since we're, this is a safe space for us, I think. So blockchain, yes, we do see it being used a lot. We see it being abused a lot. In fact, we asked a question in one of our Voice of the Enterprise surveys in InfoSec about what's the most overused or overhyped term that you've seen in security, and blockchain won hands down in 2018. That doesn't mean it's not going to be something that security practitioners shouldn't be more aware of. The implications there are in the trust in a community of participants. And that means that, when there's a will, there's a way. In principle, it could be possible to subvert that entire community of interest to essentially rewrite what's assumed to be an immutable record through blockchain. Now, of course, that's a theoretical case, but these are some of the examples of things that organizations do need to become more familiar with as they see these increasingly adopted technologies. Crypto mining is another aspect of the threat landscape that we've seen in 2018. But what do we see as the trends that will shape IT and information security in the long run? There's a few things that come to mind that we'll just kind of leave you with in this webcast for food for thought going forward. One of them is that I put this as threat from strategics, but maybe a better way to put this is the role that strategic technology suppliers can play in the years going forward. The narrow view of that within the security marketplace is the role that strategic security vendors can play out of proportion to the rest of the market. They can carry a lot of weight in the market. In fact, Jeff Moss at Black Hat last year just kind of threw out a thumbnail guess. There may be 20 companies in the world that can have an impact on shaping security for all of us going forward. So, threats from strategics, I should have put that in terms of the influence that strategics would have on the market going forward. But at the other end of the spectrum, we do see this fragmented landscape where we're characterized a lot in security by a market of features that should be features of a larger offering. That's not necessarily a bad thing, particularly in M&A, where we see strategic vendors roll up capabilities in their portfolio, assuming that they integrate them well. But one of the things that we've seen, it is a bit troubling in InfoSec, at least to me anyway, is that we've seen a lot of new plays emerge and startups emerge that are looking more to capitalize than they are necessarily to solve an existing problem. And I say that in light of the fact that we continue to have this ongoing struggle with things like identifying and prioritizing vulnerabilities or remediating vulnerabilities in software and in technology. Getting a handle on asset inventory, for that matter, continues to be a big challenge for a lot of organizations. Just addressing the basics, doing a good job of security hygiene, security housekeeping can be maddeningly difficult. And now we're talking about adding billions of new types of endpoints into the landscape that IT and operational technologies more broadly can embrace. So I am somewhat concerned when I see new venture plays come to market that look to turn, a quick flip and get a win in making inroads on being acquired more than solving a problem. The more we have solutions in search of a problem, the more this is actually compounding the issue in the marketplace. But at the same time, as we see these very large players that can have a disproportionate impact on the nature of security going forward, I'm hopeful that on the one hand, we do see approaches to new technologies, new techniques and tools being brought to market that do solve some of these long-standing problems. And in fact, in 2019, we will be keeping a closer eye on things like asset inventory, vulnerability remediation and prioritization, getting a more realistic handle on those techniques, getting a better handle on third-party risk, making things like intelligence more actionable for security operations and for security strategists more generally, as well as the role that the very large providers, from the cloud hyperscalers to the very large players in areas like social networking can have on improving security for all of us. And that's the idealistic and the optimistic view. But I continue to have hope that security is one of the most creative, one of the most innovative fields because it has to be. We deal with an intelligent adversary, and that's not something that could be said from every other technology field. And we do often attract the brightest and the best in technology to solve some of these hard problems. So I remain optimistic that we're going to continue to make headway in these directions. But there's a lot of things that we expect to keep an eye on in 2019 and beyond. And I encourage you to keep up with us as we keep that view going forward. If you'd like to look at our 2019 Trends in Information Security report in more detail, subscribers have access to it already. Follow the URL in this slide. If you're not a subscriber and like to find out more about what we do follow, what we do cover here at 451, or learn more about our 2019 report, feel free to reach out to us. Any of the contact information on our website that would be useful to us, useful to you. And with that, I think we're going to switch to the Q&A at this point. I'm going to start pouring into some of these questions. And boy, we've got quite a few. Let me start with some of the broader questions here. What do you see as the biggest challenges facing the big security vendors? I kind of touched on that a little bit in the last bit that I talked about here towards the end of the webcast. And that is in, well, I didn't really touch on it as much as this question would suggest. So one of the things that we're seeing now across the vendor landscape for the strategic vendors in particular is that we see a lot of investment in where the world has been in legacy products, and tools, and approaches to InfoSec. And we see these approaches being directly challenged by the new. So in terms of access control and network security, network segmentation, challenge being posed by trends like zero trust. And we've had to see vendors actually embrace approaches that would directly challenge their legacy investments. The classic innovator's dilemma. Are you going to embrace what could kill your legacy? Or do you have to do that in order to maintain your footing and expand your reach going forward? This has become a particular issue with vendors when they deal with cloud-native technologies in particular. Cloud providers may be able to provide what the vendors supplied to the enterprise, and the enterprise deployed it themselves in the past. So dealing with the innovator's dilemma, I think, on multiple fronts is one of the big questions that strategic security vendors have to face going forward. Do we have any visibility into what types of applications and workloads tend to stay on premises or be repatriated as opposed to what stays in the cloud or what is migrated to the cloud? The two-part answer to that. One of the parts of the answer is we've seen in general barriers to moving applications to the public cloud have gone down in the last year. We've seen more respondents say that they are willing to move business-critical applications to the public cloud in the past year more than we'd seen in prior years. So some of the barriers to that transition have gone down, but at the same time, we still see sensitivity to things like sensitive data, particularly data that's governed by privacy regulation. In the case of GDPR, for example, sensitivity to that new regulation, but at the same time being aware that a lot of what's going to be enforced with respect to GDPR may yet to be determined by case law in a lot of cases. So what's the legal precedent for determining what's considered an acceptable level of due care in those cases? Organizations that have questions about that may tend to want to retain control over those environments. At the same time, however, these same organizations need to be aware of what cloud providers can do to secure those environments better than the enterprises can do themselves. So that enters into the decision making. But in general, data that's more sensitive, data that may be proprietary and sensitive to exposure, even if it's not governed by regulation, definitely regulated data and regulated environments being one of those where enterprises do have a lot of sensitivity still, I'd say probably stands out the most. Where are IT organizations getting the talent and skills to containerize applications, leverage cloud, and other tools for analytics? In other words, where are IT organizations finding the talent to keep up with these trends in IT evolution? A lot of cases they're not. They're finding it very challenging to find that expertise, and that expertise is coming more dear all the time. We've seen organizations, particularly the larger organizations, increasingly embrace things like internship programs, in some cases working cooperatively with universities. So in the greater Atlanta area, maybe kind of a more general case, working closely with schools like Georgia Tech in their case, and that's a long-standing situation in the Atlanta area. But for those who have access to the academic world and being able to gain access to people coming new into the workforce, orienting them and training them into practices that will build their maturity, build their skills in the space. I've seen organizations beginning to turn towards these. Can't say that I've seen them in enough of a generalized sense to comment on them in terms of, are we seeing measurable quantitative data or survey-based data that reflects that in that direction, but that's food for thought in 2019 for sure. But yeah, vendors in particular are having to look to new approaches to build these technologies, and enterprises are having to look to resources beyond just the service provider to be able to serve these needs themselves. So they're having to get creative about this for sure. Are cloud-native solutions the only vendor that can address security challenges at scale IoT? And I think, I'd have to interpret that question in terms of what it means for taking in data at scale from all these myriad endpoints in operational and IoT technologies. And I'd also have to break that into, by cloud-native solutions, would we make a distinction between what's offered by the cloud hyperscalers themselves, for example, versus these more cloud-native technologies that can be embraced by the enterprise? And I think the data that I showed earlier in the discussion of cloud under Trend 1 kind of speak to that. We see nearly half of all organizations, 44% I believe it was, that plan to modernize their applications on-prem and in place. So organizations are adopting the technologies, even if they're not farming out these environments to third-party or cloud providers per se. So the short answer to that is no. Cloud providers are not the only ones that can provide these solutions. Cloud-native technologies provide elasticity and, in many cases, scale to be able to embrace them, but they're not the only approaches, for sure. with DevOps, we've seen automation built for the benefit of others in the organization, such as Ops and DevOps built for the benefit of developers so they can do self-service and deploy with greater agility. You see security automation making that same leap in the direction of DevSecOps in this case, and if not, what's holding it back? So I gave a few examples of that, and so I might have answered this question to some degree in the discussion of the DevOpsification of security. So yeah, we do see security organizations embracing automation around things like automation platforms, so the security automation and orchestration space. But in terms of security automation making that same leap, we see them working more in concert with the operational teams in terms of defining an operational environment. So things like container security definition, for example, vendors, Twistlock, Aqua, and so on. And the vendors themselves, in some cases, the cloud hyperscalers, providing similar sort of approaches to defining the environment. Working in concert with security teams to define secure configuration for those environments and relying on things like CSC Top 20, for example, and CIS definitions and so on to be able to make those definitions. So I'd say it's, I don't see it holding back so much as a general progress in that direction. If you're referring to the adoption of DevOps practices in security operations processes per se, yes, in terms of some of the things that we see organizations adopting around things like ticketing and so on to better define security operations processes, but also things like repositories for managing and maintaining security tools and threat intelligence, like the attack example I gave. So we see this coming out in various and sundry ways. Wholesale, I think it's going to take some time before we get there, but we do see a general progress in that direction. And with that, Caitlin, we have several other questions. We'll be happy to answer those via email as able. We do thank everyone for your attendance and participation today. This is always one of the more rewarding webcasts that we do during the year. And with that, Caitlin, I'll throw it back over to you.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining, and thank you, Scott. That was great. Like Scott said, we can follow up with any unanswered questions via email. And like I mentioned at the beginning of the webcast, the slide deck is available for download. And thank you all for joining. Bye-bye.